Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So the liberal use of the QR code in our presentation prior to church has had me thinking that it could have added some improvements to the events of the Bible. So here's a couple of examples of that. I think if Moses came down with a QR code instead of like a long list of words, probably the news gets faster through the Israelites. Maybe the golden calf thing doesn't turn out quite the same way. It could have been an improvement. Jesus at the Sermon on the Mount. So our family has recently been reading Matthew, chapters 5 through 7. That is a long sermon. And I mean, there was no acoustics there. He's sitting literally on a rock in a natural amphitheater. To me, if everyone can just reach up their phone and just like scan Jesus' QR code, everybody's got like all those, 180 verses. We can cut out the whole talking part. People can just go home and read it at home. So seems like that's an improvement too with the QR code. And then finally, I thought maybe the Book of Life. It's probably pretty long and a little extensive at this point. So if we could just, QR code of life, that makes that a little simpler. So when Jeff asked me to preach about 4 or 5 months ago, I didn't realize that I was starting a series, but it turned out that I was. First, about 4 months ago, we talked about secularization in America, and that was called Is Christianity Dying? And then around Christmas, I talked about the real-world evidence for the role that faith and belief plays in people's lives and in society. And that was, is Christianity good? But it was not really about the theological content of the Bible or Christianity, but more about the real-world impacts. And there's a question looming, I think, over all of it, which is, of course, is it true? And when I think about this question about the truth of Christianity, I went back to like a series of books that was written about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And there was like two genres of literature at the time, and they were in direct opposition to each other. One of them was like we're going to marshal all the evidence for the historicity of the Bible story. We're going to show you all the evidence, and we're going to build up your certainty that the Bible is true. And at the same time, there were books written by different people, the point of which was to kind of the angry atheist crowd, the point of which was to denigrate religion, making the same sort of argument that like if you actually just look at the weight of the evidence here, you're going to realize that it's all not real. It's a joke. And it strikes me looking back at this history, well, first of all, like my sympathies lie pretty obviously with one side of this fight of books, and I think that there was a lot of encouragement that came from people thinking about some of the bits of evidence around the truth of Jesus. At the same time, I think that the books by the angry atheists could be really instructive for us as Christians too, and it's good for us to have enough security in our faith that we can confront the bad parts of religious belief or the bad parts of Christian history and be honest about them and confess where we need to confess and establish those things as things we don't need to be afraid of or hide from or mislead people about. So there were good things on both sides. But one thing that strikes me is that it seems kind of quaint, the fact that people were writing these books to me 20 years ago. It feels like everybody lost when I look back on it. It feels like the people who wanted to marshal out like these clear statements of evidence for Christianity, probably a lot of them thought they could save the culture and that maybe this decline of Christianity that we're starting to see in the United States would stop. And I think that that's proven to be false. It's really accelerated since these books were written. But likewise for like the angry atheist type, these people are not looked on kindly by our secular culture anymore. Like it's tired, it's arrogant, like people aren't into that either. It's like both sides lost in some important way. And yet, when I look back on those books that were the angry atheist books, one thing that I noted when I read them in the past is that they had some premises about belief that I just didn't share. And because I didn't share those premises, those books just never were troubling to me in the way that they were to some people. And one of them is that when we think that Christianity is true, we're not saying that any Christian or group of Christians or denomination or church, even a great church, that anybody has anything everything right. Like, that's just not part of what we're saying when we say we believe in Jesus. And I've never felt that way, and so I never expected certainty and perfection out of the followers of Jesus. So because of that, my faith wasn't threatened as much by seeing examples of people not being right about everything. That's not how it hit me. And the second point was that matters of faith here on earth could be resolved with certainty. And I think in both kinds of books from that era, there was that huge desire for certainty. There was, if you really line up all the evidence, you're going to come to the end and you're going to have a conclusion, and then any rational person is going to settle on one side of that conclusion. There is that presumption. But I think that, in fact, being a human being on earth, like, our experience isn't that at all about certainty, whether positively or negatively, about anything in our lives. I feel like that movement of doubt and conviction, circling back and forth, is more like the way we actually live our lives, not a big list of things that are just obviously true. I also never felt like that Christian doctrine, like the basic theology of the Bible, was the sum of human knowledge, or was ever intended to be, because for one thing, the Bible talks about natural revelation, all the things that encountering the universe, encountering creation, we can learn things about God and about nature by studying it. I never felt a contradiction at all between the efforts of science and the efforts of religion, so I wasn't threatened by that. And at the same time, I knew something about science, which sometimes people found convenient to forget, which is that science doesn't arrive at eternal truths either. In fact, science is just a method. It's just a way of asking questions. It's a way of adjusting your answers to things as you get more information. But it doesn't uncover the ultimate answers to the ultimate questions or the eternal truths any more than anything else does. It wasn't there. So we can look back at the life of Jesus, because Jesus was constantly surrounded of the question of, is it true? From the beginning of his ministry, are you really the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? Are you really healing people on the Sabbath? Do you really have God's power? Is it true, or have you come to save us? Jesus is constantly being asked the question of whether it's true. And I think that he answers that question in four very different ways, in fact. And one of them is with his simple affirmations, it is as you say. Sometimes he has very few words, but a simple yes or a simple no. Other times, rather than put words into the universe, he demonstrates God's power. And there are miracles and healings and astonishing, inexplicable, supernatural answers to the question, which aren't in words at all. I think he also answers these questions when he's being interrogated and pressed with stories and parables. And there are really interesting reasons for why he might answer with a story rather than with a proposition or a statement, but I think that's something that we see with Jesus a lot. And sometimes he comes back with his own challenging questions. He turns the questions back at the people who are asking, and it comes out of having a sense of what they're intending, what they're asking, if they're trying to trap him, why they're trying to trap him, what their motivation is. And I think that this sermon could have been this. We could have talked about, why does Jesus answer the question of is it true in very different ways, and what are the purposes for us being able to answer that question in different ways. But I was a philosophy major in college, and thinking about this had me wondering to myself, what are the things that I'm most certain about in my life? What are the things that I have real conviction that is lasting, where even if there is that natural human movement between doubt and certainty, that there's like stability to what I believe. And there's a long history of this in philosophy, and trying to ask the question, what do we really know? What can we be certain about? And the theory of knowledge in philosophy is called epistemology, and you can see it all in the history of Western philosophy. A really famous version of this is Descartes, who asked the question, what can I know of certainty? And he landed at, I think, therefore I am. I can't really be sure of all these things around me, but I know there's something here in me that's thinking, and that can be the foundation of what we know. And there's a tradition of philosophy to ask that question in different ways and to come up with different answers. But for me, I think that when I think about what I'm most certain about, it starts with what I see in the world around me. So I just actually wanted to take a minute to say, what are the truest things that I know? Like, what is really clear in my experience, the things that I don't need to talk myself into, that I feel that less of that movement between doubt and certainty. And for me, I think the most intuitive truths that I see about the world around me is just the incredible scope of the universe, the unthinkable grandeur and scale of what's around us. The fact that in our galaxy there are 100 billion stars, and that as far as we can tell there are that many galaxies, and the absolutely unthinkable scale of all of creation is something that to me is it just lands for me, and it feels true, and I feel like such a sense of conviction about the grandeur of what's around us. But at the same time, I think that I feel this sense of certainty about when you examine even the smallest things, not just the large scale of the universe, that you see beauty and purpose and just awe in encountering small things. So whether it's you have a microscope and you're looking at a blade of grass, or you're looking at how the smallest creatures work, those things to me are equally astonishing. And I have this sense of conviction that something important is happening when we're attentive to the smallest things as well as the largest things. And then finally, just the life, being here at all, I have this sense of conviction that it's true and meaningful because life somehow arose in a world, in a universe that at one point did not have life. That even there's a cycle between life and death, that living things give birth to other living things, but even as we die, we provide food and sustenance to other creatures that replace us. There's this cycle to our lives and our deaths that's so powerful. So this is one block for me, is like these observations of the natural world, which to me are the truest things that I see. But then of course there's the mess and mass of our tangle of human experience. I think that the fact that we as people have such an abiding sense of justice, of things being wrong or right and good or bad, no matter what you believe theologically, like people so strongly and intuitively have a sense of what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong. And that seems really obvious to me when I look at the world. Equally obvious is that this is a world that's full of hypocrites and failures, starting with myself, that nobody, no matter what their closely held beliefs are about what's good and what's true, nobody lives up to it. Nobody manages to live out the perfection to which that they aspire or where they see the world, that we fall completely short of it. And then finally, about not just human experience, but about life, I just have a really strong sense of suffering and death, how the wrongness that it seems to convey to me in my own experience, whether it's my own suffering or the suffering of other people. Death, sometimes people talk about death just being, the natural order of things, but that's not my experience at all. To me, death is the opposite of that. Death is the most unnatural thing in our experience, and it sits in this direct contrast to our joy and our pleasure and our hope and our life, and somehow these things are both true at the same time. And when I think about the God who might have created this world that has these incredible things, both great and small, and this human mess underneath it, I have some moral intuitions about God. One of those is that if there's a good God wouldn't be distant from all this suffering in this world. And like sort of the Thomas Jefferson deist watchmaker God who turns the watch and then sets it down and walks away, that can't be a good God to me. And that comes out of my moral intuition about suffering. That we need some kind of a rescue, that it's intolerable, that where we are, the lostness we have, the pain we cause ourselves and others, the suffering we experience, that we need a rescue and it has to be huge. That's right there. That things can't stay this way, that where we are right now is not the final place of things and can't be. That's something I have a strong intuition about. And for God to be love, a lot of people say that God is love, both Christians and non-Christians, but for that to be true as a proposition, that doesn't make sense to me unless that there is relationship in some sense at the heart of the universe and at the heart of God. Well, a good God wouldn't need to be distant from suffering. That's the incarnation. That's the idea that God, not apart from us and separate from the sufferings of his creation, actually descends down into human flesh and experiences what we experience. There's a Christian doctrine for that. That's the incarnation. The rescue needs to be massive. Well, that's the crucifixion. That's Jesus on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? The separation actually coming to God. Things can't stay this way. Well, that's the resurrection. That's the idea that actually this order of things now can be broken and will be broken. And with the second coming is broken forever. And then that problem of for God to be love, that's the Trinity. That's the idea that even though there is one God, from eternity, God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are together in relationship, which makes it possible that love is the heart of the universe. And I think what's interesting about thinking about these four problems this way is that these four bits of theology have probably caused more people to fall away over the history of religion than anything else. When you read about like the councils in the second and third and fourth century, when you read about the encounters between Christianity and other religions, these are the four doctrines that people couldn't accept. So just where Christian theology is the strangest and the hardest is actually where I have my strongest moral intuitions about the universe. And that's a really interesting point, and it feels true to me that just where reality is strange, Christianity is also strange on these really difficult doctrines. And likewise, when I look at the tangle of human experience, the suffering that we see around us, how it feels intolerable, well, there's Christian theology that has a story here that is compelling. That's judgment. That's the moral imperative that we all feel. It's sin. It's our inability to live that out. That's heaven and hell and hope and despair, which we see all around us simultaneously. It's all there. And so we have Christian doctrine that speaks resonantly to that mess that we're in. And when we look at the scope of what we see, the incredible grandeur of the universe, the beauty of small things, we learn about God. We see the omnipotence and the power that was required to create it. We see God's transcendence, God's separation from creation, but also God's immanence, being close, and even in the smallest things. And in the variety and unbelievable diversity of it, we see God's creativity. And so this is God's character made known to anyone who's looking. And so notice what we've done here. We've reverse engineered Christian theology out of observations about the world, about, to me, what are the most truest things in my experience. When I back those out and I see what Jesus, what the Bible has for us, I find something really compelling there. And my experience of the truth of the Bible is that it gets personal. For me, when we come to really know something true, it's less like agreeing to a principle, and it's more like having something personally land with you. In other words, it's more like a person than a thing. And Jesus actually puts that explicitly. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And truth is personal, and that also is my experience of Christian theology. Paul writes in Corinthians, love rejoices in the truth. And I think that when we encounter, again, things that are true in our lives, there's a delight to that, which I find here. And then finally, truth liberates. A lot of that is because truth allows us to put down our pretensions and our misapprehensions and to set down the walls that we put around ourselves and to put down ease our grasping for a moment and just to be present with what's true. And Jesus speaks of that as truth being liberating, that you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. But paradoxically, I feel like even though truth is liberating, I feel like somehow I'm captured by it at the same time that I'm liberated by it. And the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had a great description of this, which he said, the truth is a trap. You cannot get it without its getting you. You cannot get the truth by capturing it, only by its capturing you. And I feel a paradox there that's really resonant to me, that even though my experience of finding truth is liberating, it also, in some sense, feels like coming home and coming back into a pen and being captured too. And there's power in that to me. So when I think about Christian truths, I feel like it's so true that it doesn't need me to believe it perfectly, or even to believe it at all, because in my moments of doubt or despair, it goes on being true because it's not based on my feelings. I don't have to believe it hard to make it real because it's independent of me. That it's so true that Jesus kindly puts out his hands to show his wounds to those who doubt. It's so true that the tiniest little bit of faith, even if it's just the mustard seed size, connects us with the power of the universe. And my experience of coming into contact with Jesus is that my sense of conviction about the truth of Christianity, it emerges from my closest attention to the world. Not when I'm distracted or doubtful, but when I'm really being thoughtful and engaged with the world, it emerges. That it speaks to the state of my soul, that it nurtures my compassion for others. It shakes me out of indolence and despair. It offers profundity and hope, and it builds the foundation of my understanding about everything else. That's the operation that it has in my life. And Lewis has a great quote about this, which is that, "I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And he uses the metaphor of a shed in your backyard. And there's a tiny hole poked in the shed. And if you open the door to the shed, you can see the beam of the light coming down, right? You can actually see that beam. But not only can you see the beam itself, but you know that the reflected illumination of that beam is causing you to be able to see the rest of the shed. And that also is my experience, that when the illumination that I feel from connecting to Jesus actually helps me see other things around me as well. It has this illuminating effect. And yet, we still live in a world that does not offer us certainties. And Lewis had something to say about this too. He said, "Now that I am a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable." And I think that's really profound because we are people who are not afforded certainties in our life. But I also think that we can be really practical about the implications of that. And this is where we get practical and we talk about what to do if it might be true. Because actually there's a lot to say about this natural movement of doubt and conviction that we have and what we can do in those moments. And I think the first point is to mind the craft. I've been reading a book recently called Prayer in the Night by Tish Harrison Warren, and she said this: "Faith, I've come to believe, is more craft than feeling. And prayer is our chief practice in the craft." I think probably, especially now as contemporary people, we're really wanting the feeling of believing, that, yeah, I feel that right now. But in fact, feeling often comes later in the process and far behind action. So whether it's the discipline of prayer or the discipline of reading the scripture or a fasting, whatever that might be, the feeling often is a product of those things, not something that you try to get right first before you do those things. When I was a freshman in college, this quote from Mere Christianity changed my life. The question Lewis was posing was, if you're someone who does not love God, you don't feel anything for God, but you would like to love God, what do you do about that? And Lewis writes, act as if you did. Don't sit trying to manufacture feelings. Ask yourself, if I was sure that I love God, what would I do? And when you've found the answer, go and do it. And again, this idea that we as people, action comes first. And whether that action is the mindfulness to the craft of seeking Jesus with the ways that we know how to do that, or doing the works of mercy that he's called us to, we often find that the feelings and the convictions are an outcome of doing the things that he calls us to do, not something that we have to get right first before we act. And I think the second point is to touch the hands. I alluded to Jesus showing the wounds in his hands. And it's one of the most tender stories in the New Testament to me. Thomas saying, unless I see the nails marks and I touch them and I touch the wounds in his side, I'm not going to believe that he rose from the dead. I'm sorry, I just can't. And Jesus, when he encounters Thomas, just has such gentleness for that, and not only extends his hands and not only shows his side, but even remembers us and says, "Blessed are those who didn't get to touch my hands, and yet they believe." And yet, I think that we still have a way to touch the hands now, even if we're not in the same boat as Thomas. And what are some of the ways that we do that? And here I actually want to turn it over to you. How can we touch the hands of Jesus now?
Well, prayer is a pretty good way, I think.
I'm talking about practical, real-world touching. Part of the answer is that wherever ministry is being done, that is feeding the poor, caring for the sick, acts of mercy, acts of grace, God is in those things. Jesus is in those things. And so by going where the ministry is, that's a way for us to see the hands of Jesus in action and to touch them as they do their work. But above and beyond that, the answer is us, because we are the body of Christ. We're the hands and feet of Jesus. And that's why it's so important for us to keep meeting together, to be connected with each other, to be encouraging and ministering to each other, is that we are the hands and feet that we touch. And that helps, again, provide us with this sense of conviction about the truth of what we believe.
I was going to say that.
And then finally, I think there's a leap to be made. I talked about Kierkegaard briefly, and Kierkegaard is famous for talking about a leap into faith. And Kierkegaard is from Denmark 200 plus years ago. At the time, there's an established church in Denmark, right? Everyone is part of the Danish church. It's the official state church. You know, the process, you receive baptism as a baby, you do communion, everybody does it. And Kierkegaard hated it. He turned out to be a committed Christian, but he hated the Church of Denmark. And he hated it because it meant nothing, because it was just part of the culture. It was something that everybody did. It was part of being polite society, but it didn't represent actually any kind of a leap into or trust in God. It didn't represent any sacrifice from people. It didn't represent anything that was life-changing or life-altering for people. It was just the process of life, and he couldn't stand that. And he was really challenging people, no, we actually need to make a leap if we're going to come to knowledge of what's true. And part of that is the leap to Jesus. And that, of course, makes me think of Peter, who's on the Sea of Galilee, and the storm's terrible, and he sees Jesus, and Peter says, if it's really you, call me to come to you in the water. And Jesus says, come. And Peter gets out of the boat, and I just can't stop to think of anything but how stupid this is. Like, why did Peter want that test? Like, if it's really you, I can walk on water now? Like, what leads him to think that, suddenly he's more buoyant or has less density than water? Like, why is that the test for if that's really Jesus? And at the same time, there's something so beautiful and simple, and he just wants to leap and get out of the boat and get to where Jesus is, even if physics oppose it, even if it would take a miracle of God for him to get there. He just tumbles his way out of the boat. And we know he just takes a couple steps and then he starts to sink. And Jesus is there. Jesus is there to catch him. And there's something so beautiful about this in its childlikeness, which we see a lot with Peter, its boldness, but also the fact that he was willing to make this leap, even this leap that didn't make sense, and that Jesus was there to catch him at the other side of the leap. And I think for people who are just meeting Jesus for the first time, there's a leap at the beginning. There's a sense that I may not have total certainty right now, but Jesus seems good and I want to trust. And I think that we see that with Peter in this moment at the boat. He's like, that's Jesus and I'm going there. And there's a leap outwards. And to me, that leap forward to trusting Jesus is absolutely fundamental to us having a sense of conviction that he's good and that he's true. And as we come to near the end here, I've been thinking about words and whether or not words can actually be a source of truth and conviction for us. Thomas Aquinas was probably the leading theologian of the Middle Ages. And in an era before the printing press, he wrote thousands and thousands of pages of theology and was just incredibly gifted and incredibly committed to building up the church of his time. And no one was more prolific of the era in terms of writing. About a month before he died, about 4 or 5 weeks before he died, he was in church, he was in Mass, and he had a vision. And when he got to the end of his vision, he left church, and later on that day, his assistant came to him and said, "Okay, we need to get going, because you're writing this doctrinal statement. It's in response to this heresy. You're saying we have to get to work." And Aquinas said, "I'm done. My entire life's work, I've been for 30 years, I've been constantly writing about Christianity, and I'm done. I'm done." And here's what he said. He said, "All that I've written seems to me like straw compared to what has now been revealed to me." And Aquinas didn't write straw. Like these thousands of pages that he wrote are still the basis of Catholic theology, for one thing, but they still inspire and challenge, and they bring conviction. And what's more, I think that they're still true. And this experience of Aquinas, of encountering God and then going silent, it wasn't distancing him from Jesus. It wasn't distancing him from the faith, because up to the end of his life, he continued to be very committed to church and prayer, and his devotional life didn't disappear. None of that happened. He just went silent with his voice. And I think my greatest source of conviction about the truth of Christianity comes from moments when I fall silent. And one of the things that makes me fall silent is when I see Jesus out in the wild. And recently I saw something that felt like Jesus out in the wild to me, and I wanted to share it with you. So at the start of December, there was a domestic dispute outside of a store in Texas, and a police officer responded and got involved. And unfortunately, he was shot and killed. And the man who shot the police officer then turned around and shot himself. But he did not kill himself. He ended up in a serious condition, but then he stabilized. After this police officer was shot, there was a funeral at the church that he attended in Texas. And his 18-year-old daughter gave a eulogy at this funeral. And I'm going to share with you just about 90 seconds from her eulogy for her father now.
I have heard all the stories you can think of, but I've always had such a hard time with how the suspect is dealt with. Not that I didn't think there should be justice served, but my heart always ached for those who don't know Jesus. Their actions being a reflection of that. I was always told that I would feel differently if it happened to me, but as it's happened to my own father, I think I still feel the same. There has been anger, sadness, grief, and confusion, and part of me wishes I could despise the man who did this to my father, but I can't get any part of my heart to hate him. All that I can find is myself hoping and praying for this man to truly know Jesus. I thought this might change if the man continued to live, but when I heard the news that he was in stable condition, part of me was relieved. My prayer is that someday down the road, I'd get to spend some time with the man who shot my father. Not to scream at him, not to yell at him, not to scold him, simply to tell him about Jesus. I've spent the past few days thinking about what it was like for my daddy to live lifeless in the flesh, but full of life with our Father in heaven. I wonder what it was like to reunite with his father, to see his other officers who fell in the line of duty, but mostly to sit at the right hand of Jesus. I can imagine it's a much better place than here.
I don't know if I have ever felt more conviction about the truth of Christianity than when Botham Jean was shot and killed a few years ago, and his brother, Brant Jean, hugged the woman who'd killed him and said he'd forgiven her. Or when Dylan Roof shot a bunch of people at a church Bible study in Charleston, and the beautiful stories of forgiveness that came out of that moment. And Jesus is so real to me in those moments in a way that is not bounded by words, not bounded by my ability to be clever or thoughtful, but in my encounter with him. And he gives us a way to still encounter him in the flesh today. And we're going to share in the Lord's Supper to celebrate that.